Hello, my beloveds. In the silence of a quiet room, let us gently travel back in time, past the hustle and bustle of modern hours, past the noise of cars and conversations, past the burden of our own day. Tonight we will stop, and we will slowly turn our thoughts to the candlelit rooms and silent tapestries of another world, not far away, but long folded in the pages of forgotten memory. We are in France. Not the France of postcards, cafes, or newspaper headlines, but the France of the 16th century, the France of powdered wigs and cold stone corridors, the France of whispering courtiers and long silken halls where secrets flowed more freely than truth, the France that took its time. Our guide through this silence of history is a man named Francis. Francis I is King of France, a monarch in shining armor and dirty boots, who laughed loudly at a banquet table and whispered quietly behind drawn curtains. He was crowned in gold, but often he was clothed in scandal. His legacy is embroidered not only in the banners of war and treaties signed with trembling hands, but also in the scent of rosewater perfume on the shoulder of a mistress. This is a world where beauty is used as a weapon, and affection can be bought, exchanged, or betrayed. And at the center of it all sits one man, Francis I, King of France, lover of poetry and palaces, patron of geniuses, and participant. In this story, we will not rush to conclusions. We will linger on the texture of things, the bend of a jeweled ring, the bitterness of a forgotten betrayal, the smell of ink still drying on the edge of a treasonous note. This is a story not only of history, but of pace, of how slowly the powerful rise and how quietly they fall. So breathe easy. Let your mind settle like dust in the folds of a velvet chair. The story begins. The candles are already lit. The windows are already open to the gentle breeze of the Loire Valley. And someone somewhere is whispering your name behind a painted fan. Before we begin, I invite you to immerse yourself deeper into this quiet hour with us. If you find this slow unfolding of the story soothing, or if it helps you drift a little closer to sleep, I hope you will subscribe. A small gesture, but a meaningful one. You can also leave a gentle comment. Tell us how you felt during this story, whether it captivated you or helped you slow down. Let us know where you are listening from, too. Maybe you are curled up in the north of Scotland, or dozing in a warm room in the Canadian countryside. Wherever you are, we are happy to welcome you here. And if there is a place or person in history that you would like to visit next time, quietly, leisurely, feel free to share that too. But for now, let's get back to France. It is a cool morning in the Château de Fontainebleau. The air outside is damp and quiet, with a slow mist curling above the surface of the Grand Parterre gardens. Inside, the halls remain dim, the only movement being the occasional hush of servants passing on soft leather-soled shoes. The great walnut-paneled chamber of King Francis I still slumbers in partial gloom, though dawn has pressed itself gently against the tall glass panes. The fire in the hearth has long since dwindled to embers, casting a faint orange glow upon the inlaid floorboards. The king sleeps soundly in a canopied bed carved from oak, its posts wrapped in heavy burgundy brocade. The air smells faintly of rosewater and old wood polish. A folded garment, a doublet stitched with gold thread, rests across a nearby armchair. Francis I is nearing the end of his third decade as king. His once athletic build is softening with age. His face is marked by the deep lines of both laughter and thought. He is not yet awake, but already his court has begun to stir. A valet quietly enters and lays out a robe lined with fur. A tray of warmed wine and soft bread is placed near the hearth. The chateau is silent but not still. From one of the galleries, the soft shuffle of musicians tuning lutes and viols floats gently through the stone corridors. Down in the kitchens, the thick smell of broth and boiling chestnuts wafts upward. In the queen's apartments, further removed from the king's wing, gentle voices speak in slow murmurs, occupied with fabrics and embroidery. Francis stirs. He speaks a single name, perhaps one of his many past companions, or perhaps not a name at all. He is known to mix dreams with memory. In the hush of his chamber, his history stretches around him. The wars he fought, the poets he patronized, the women he loved and left. Here in Fontainebleau, the king had cultivated a palace of art and sensuality. Frescoes imported from Italy still line the gallery walls. A Venus reclines eternally beneath curling vines. Francis, who had once parleyed with Leonardo da Vinci himself, keeps the aging master's works under lock in a room nearby. Now awake, the king rises slowly. He steps onto a carpet of pale Flemish wool, and a servant wraps the robe around his shoulders. The king is silent. Outside, the mist is beginning to lift. He moves toward the tall windows. Beyond the glass, a single deer stands still among the trees. The king observes it with idle interest. There's a small rustle from the corridor, and then a sigh, like wind brushing a curtain. Francis turns but does not speak. In his dressing room, his barber lays out a set of razors and combs. Water is poured into a shallow copper basin. The daily rituals will begin. Slowly, gently, without haste. Francis will be dressed, his beard trimmed, and a scented pomade applied to his temples. He will pass through the long gallery where mirrors line the walls and portraits of his ancestors look on with oil-painted serenity. A document awaits his attention, a letter from the Venetian ambassador perhaps, or a verse sent by Clément Marot. But these can wait. For now, the king's gaze returns to the deer, which has vanished into the woods. Far from the vibrancy of Fontainebleau, the queen once resided in the chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Queen Claude, daughter of Louis XII and Anne of Brittany, was married young to Francis. She was pious, soft-spoken, and perpetually expectant, pregnant almost every year of her married life. She had little taste for the revels of court and found greater comfort in gardens and chapels. In the stone cloisters of Saint-Germain, where the morning bells tolled softly, she walked with her ladies-in-waiting beneath trimmed yew hedges. The scent of lavender and boxwood followed her steps. Birds nested in the ivy that curled around the chapel eaves. Claude bore 7 children. Her time was marked by cycles of confinement and mourning, and she rarely entered the political or artistic conversations that so delighted her husband. She embroidered, she prayed, she mourned. Her world was one of gentle repetition, morning mass, midday silence, evening prayer. Sometimes she would sit by a window for hours, hands still, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. Her eyes would wander over the low hills or rest on a single cloud drifting across the sky. These were her moments of solitude. The queen's favorite pastime was the care of her herb garden. Rows of sage, rosemary, and thyme bordered narrow paths of crushed oyster shell. She found solace in pruning lavender and collecting chamomile to send to the infirmary. Occasionally, she would offer a small bunch to one of her ladies, tied with a blue ribbon. Letters from the king arrived regularly, sometimes loving, often practical. He addressed her as our good and well-beloved. In time, Claude came to expect little more. She gave generously to hospitals and convents. She died young, her body worn by childbirth, leaving behind a court that hardly paused. The women who came after her were not quiet. They moved through the galleries and tapestries like perfume, fragrant, bold, impermanent. But Claude remains a figure untouched by scandal, known for gentleness in an age that remembered far more dramatic women. To some, her portrait remains the most restful in the gallery. A pale face beneath a Breton headdress, her eyes cast downward, a small book clasped in her fingers. Nothing more, nothing less. And yet, in the stillness of that painted gaze, there is a dignity that endures. Françoise de Foix was among the first to capture the king's devoted attention. The daughter of a noble Breton family, she was both poised and intelligent. Her arrival at court was subtle, like the first flush of peach blossoms in April, noticeable only to those paying attention. Her beauty was not of the kind that overtook a room. Rather, she was like a soft light, steady and refined. Francis, newly crowned and flushed with victory from Marignano, was taken by her restraint, her dignity. She did not flaunt her presence. She was, in many ways, the opposite of the court's flamboyant ladies. He made her Countess of Chateaubriand. Her husband, a man of some position, was compensated for his tolerance. Their arrangement became an open secret. The court, always eager for distraction, whispered her name in the galleries and salons, comparing her favor to the Queen's quiet shadow. For several years, she presided as unofficial consort. She received tributes from poets, jewels from the king, and invitations to intimate councils. Her apartments were decorated with Flemish tapestries, gilded mirrors, and a painting of the Virgin that had once hung in her family's ancestral chapel. She was not political by nature, but she knew how to listen. She would sit beside the king during long evenings, her hands folded, her gaze attentive. He read aloud from romances or epistles, and she would sometimes comment with a small smile or a gentle question. These moments were not grand, but they lingered in his memory. But court life is fickle. As new women arrived, bolder, younger, more ambitious, Françoise found herself stepping slowly into the background. She returned to her husband's estate in Brittany. Some said it was her choice. Others whispered of quiet dismissal. She died in 1537. Rumors, never confirmed, claimed she was locked in a tower by a jealous husband and left to die. Her name faded, but her brief reign lingered in songs sung by court musicians on winter evenings. Occasionally, her likeness would be glimpsed in a forgotten miniature, a locket in a drawer, her features softened by time and dust. A courtier would pause, remember her perfume, the hush of her voice, and then move on. Anne de Pisseleu came like wind through open shutters, unexpected, irreverent, and impossible to ignore. She arrived at court with clever eyes and a tongue sharpened by education. Born to a lesser noble family, she had been raised in the household of a duchess and trained in Latin, poetry, and courtly etiquette. Anne did not wait to be noticed. She laughed in the king's presence. She corrected his Greek. She moved with the confidence of someone who had studied portraits of queens and thought herself not lesser. Within months, she became the king's chief mistress. She dressed in silks dyed in pale saffron and sea green. Her chambers were filled with books, manuscripts, and drawings, many of them gifts from Francis himself. She patronized poets and philosophers. She debated with visiting scholars. When the king's mood darkened, she was the one who lifted it. But she also made enemies. Her wit, So admired by some, was considered cutting by others. Courtiers spoke her name with both admiration and resentment. She wielded influence without apology. Frances elevated her family. Her brothers were granted titles and lands. She was named Duchess of Étampes. Even as the king aged, even as his health wavered and his appetite for diplomacy waned, Anne remained. She was seen reading Erasmus in her garden pavilion, wearing a gown the color of frost. At night, her candle burned late as she composed letters and rewrote court speeches. Her influence extended beyond the bedroom. It touched treaties, appointments, and policy. When Frances died in 1547, Anne's star fell swiftly. The new king, Henry II, Claude's son, banished her from court. Her power dissolved like frost in spring. But for nearly 2 decades, Anne had been at the heart of France's courtly life, irreverent, eloquent, and unforgettable. In quiet moments, some claimed to see her walking alone by the Seine, dressed in gray, her hair hidden beneath a plain hood. She did not speak to those who greeted her, but they remembered the sharp glint in her eye and the memory of a woman who had once commanded the ear of a king. Before the splendor of Catherine de' Medici or the intrigues of the Valois court, there was Diane de Poitiers, a woman whose grace seemed eternal, like a marble figure in moonlight. She was not the mistress of Francis I, but her presence hovered at the edge of his court, later shaping the life of his son, Henry II. Her place here is fitting, for the story of courtly desire and influence cannot exclude her. Diane was born in 1499, and by the time she came to influence, she was already a widow. Her beauty was remarked upon not in passing, but as something singular, tempered by wisdom and time. Her hair, ash blonde, was usually bound in coils. Her gowns were modest, but immaculately cut. She wore few jewels, an elegant chain at her neck, a pearl ring, a brooch with her initials. At the court of Francis I, she moved carefully. She had been lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude, and she continued to serve in various capacities. Her gaze, serene and pale, seldom wavered. She was not the sort to giggle or fawn. She was always composed. Diane believed in order. She bathed in cold water daily. She rose early, ate lightly, and read Latin poetry. She corresponded with philosophers and managed her estates personally. She drank spring water from a silver goblet and slept beneath unlined linen to purify the skin. When the young Henry, second son of Francis, returned from Spanish captivity, he found comfort in Diane's calmness. She became a mother figure at first, a steady voice in the turbulence of the court. But as the years passed, the nature of their bond shifted. Despite the wide gap in years, Henry adored her. When he became king in 1547, Diane held immense power. But even in Francis's lifetime, Diane's shadow loomed. Courtiers watched her carefully, noting who bowed more deeply, who visited her apartments, who copied her sober style of dress. Her home at Annette became a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the ambitious. She outlived many of her rivals. When she died in 1566, the roses at Annette were said to have bloomed late into autumn. At the heart of any royal court lies a quieter world, one shaped not by proclamations and tournaments, but by whispers. The court of Francis I was no exception. Beneath the surface of music, poetry, and painted ceilings, there were rivalries and secrets as fragile and venomous as frost-bitten fruit. Letters passed between courtiers under layers of ribbon and wax. Gossip found its way into the folds of silk sleeves and the shadows of curtained alcoves. Mistresses were not simply romantic diversions. They were symbols of faction. To favor one was to offend another. Behind every gesture, an offered hand, a smile held too long, there was meaning. There were women at court who learned to navigate this unspoken terrain. Louise de Montmorency, for instance, carried herself with such silence that some believed she heard more than she ever let on. She once stood behind a pillar in the gallery of Francis I for nearly an hour, unnoticed, simply listening. The king, though often distracted by matters of state and beauty, was not blind to the machinations around him. His ministers would murmur of discontent in Toulouse, a bishop's ambition in Lyon, a Spanish envoy who spoke too warmly to one of the ladies in waiting. But even he could not always control the web that spun through the stone corridors of his palaces. Poison, real or metaphorical, was a fear that never truly faded. An unseasoned stew, a gift of perfumed gloves, even the sweet smoke of incense in the chapel, all could be suspect. Whether real or imagined, suspicion followed power like a shadow. One story, never confirmed, told of a minor noble who had intended to win favor by removing a rival through a tincture slipped into a pitcher of cider. The plan failed. The glass shattered before it could be drunk. The pieces were gathered in silence. No accusations followed. But the nobleman was never seen at court again. Such stories became the quiet threads of courtly tapestry. They wove beneath the golden leaves and smiling portraits, ever present, always unseen. Though the court of Francis I was marked by poetry and political strategy, it was also sustained by laughter, of a quieter sort, measured and soft. Within the marble halls and beneath the painted ceilings, jesters roamed freely. They were allowed to speak truths others could not. Cloaked in humor, their insights passed unchallenged. One such figure was Triboulet, whose name has outlived many of the nobles he mocked. Triboulet walked with a stoop, his head perpetually tilted as if listening for secrets whispered by the stone itself. He wore a hood with bells that barely jingled. His voice was dry and unhurried, and his words lingered. He once remarked, "A wise man dances only when no one watches, and a fool dances always." The king, I think, is a wise fool. Francis reportedly laughed heartily at this, though others paled. There were other jesters, less memorable perhaps, but all played their part in the court's balance. They hosted mock trials, created rhyming insults, and occasionally acted as messengers of peace. Their presence allowed tensions to ease in carefully timed performances. Minor scandals, too, were commonplace. A courtier caught kissing the wrong handmaid. A noblewoman whose lapdog wore stolen jewels. A bishop with a fondness for card games that exceeded his allowance. These matters were often addressed not with harsh punishment, but with silent removal or quiet reassignment. The court preferred to preserve the appearance of grace, even if it meant relocating the trouble to a distant estate or abbey. These lesser disturbances gave rhythm to court life. Without them, it would have been too still, too perfect to be real. At the edge of the palace chapel, colored light spilled across the stone floor. The stained glass windows, high above the pews, told stories in red and blue and gold. Saints looked down with calm detachment. Angels leaned over cities rendered in miniature. Francis I often sat beneath these windows, not to pray, though he did, but to think. The flickering colors reminded him of battles past, of women whose laughter he could not recall, of poets whose verses lingered in his memory. He was a man who loved beauty, and stained glass was one of the highest forms. It blended faith and art, humility and grandeur. The glassmakers were men he sometimes met, spoke with, encouraged. He admired their patience. He once commissioned a window in memory of his sister, Marguerite. It showed Saint Cecilia holding a broken harp. A falcon, Marguerite's symbol, flew across the top panel. The work took 4 years to complete. When it was unveiled, Francis remained seated for a long time, saying nothing. These windows held more than saints. They held reflections of courtiers, mistresses, rivals. In the colored light, all faces were equal. All secrets seemed softened. On stormy days, the windows darkened. Only a few hues shone through, like distant jewels. On such days, Francis sometimes walked alone through the chapel. His footsteps echoed beneath the ribbed vaults. He once paused before a pane showing the Annunciation. The Virgin, modest and bowed, reminded him, perhaps, of Claude, or perhaps of no one. The stories in glass said only what one brought to them. The court moved around him. Pages bowed, candles flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a jester laughed. Francis remained still, his face washed in red and gold. The air within the stone walls of the Château de Fontainebleau hung heavy with rosewater and restrained grief. It was early spring, and a light mist clung to the damp corners of the courtyard, seeping into cloaks and veils. In her chambers, Queen Claude of France sat in the wan morning light, her embroidery resting silently on her lap. A pale stretch of linen spilled over her knees, stitched faintly with gold thread that caught the sun as it moved timidly across the chamber floor. Claude had always spoken little, and even now, in her 6th year of marriage to King Francis, her voice remained hushed like a cloistered bell. Her husband's brilliance had long outshone her presence at court. But hers was a gentler light, less celebrated and more enduring. The Queen's eyes followed the flicker of a flame in the hearth as she listened to the faint sounds of court life beyond her chamber door. There had been whispered again. Another name, another lady of the court who smiled too warmly at the king. Claude did not react. She rarely did. Her sense of duty had taken root early, and she found solace in quiet things, in prayer, in her children, in the silent companionship of her ladies-in-waiting. Today, though, there was a stillness that reached beyond the ordinary quiet. The Queen's hands trembled slightly as she resumed her stitching. Outside, a blackbird sang its lonely song in the fog. Not far from the Queen's silent world, another woman moved with gentle boldness through the marble corridors. Anne de Pisseleu, Duchess of Étampes, the king's most enduring mistress, had a voice like softened silk and eyes that gleamed with wit beneath long lashes. She was intelligent, careful, and always attentive to the subtle shifts in favor at court. Anne did not mistake her place. She knew hers was a perch built delicately on the whims of a mercurial king, and the sharp judgment of rival courtiers. But her charm was quiet, never showy, and that made her more dangerous than the brighter stars who came before her. In the king's private study, the Duchess stood behind him, reading softly from a Latin poem she had selected for its melancholy tone. Francis listened with his chin resting on his hand, his eyes half closed. He liked these moments best, not the riotous hunting feasts or grand councils, but the hush of candlelight and cultivated company. Anne understood that. "Is the ending too sorrowful?" she asked after a pause. Francis smiled faintly. "Sorrow," he murmured, "is a luxury I enjoy in moderation." Her laugh was quiet. It filled the chamber like warm incense. And so the king's affection for Anne deepened, not in sweeping passion, but through moments of shared understanding. She was the companion of his mind more than his body, and that intimacy proved more enduring. The affairs of state continued, as they must, beneath the low tapestries of the council chamber. Francis sat at the head of the long table, flanked by aging diplomats and freshly ambitious nobles. The matters at hand were not thrilling. Trade routes, coin minting, the appointment of regional judges. Yet behind these dry topics lingered currents of deeper intrigue. Cardinal du Bellay whispered quietly to Chancellor Poyer as a fire cracked in the hearth. The Duchess's influence was rising, and with it, the Queen's quiet faction grew increasingly tense. Some ministers wondered, aloud only in private, if Anne de Pisseleu guided more than just the King's choice in verse. Still, Francis, now older and heavier in body than in his triumphant youth, showed little concern. His attention was split these days between his lingering illnesses, his court's shifting alliances, and the distant murmur of another Habsburg maneuver to the east. In the quiet between discussions, the king fingered a gold ring worn thin by decades of wear. It was once a token from Claude, the wife he rarely touched now, except with regret. A small draft moved through the windows, and the candles wavered. Time passed with the subtle determination of ivy up stone. By the late 1540s, the king had become more shadow than light. His laughter reduced to a few soft chuckles during long meals that bored him. His body betrayed him, afflicted by syphilis and the weariness of years at court. In his final months, Francis preferred the solitude of Château de Rambouillet. There, surrounded by groves of trembling poplars and forgotten staircases, he wandered slowly through rooms filled with fading portraits and dusty books. Anne remained at his side, though the magic of their conversations had dimmed. He now spoke more often of old hunts, of lost friends, of Italy and its gleaming palaces, and, on rare evenings, of his children. The Queen had passed quietly in 1524, and though Francis never spoke much of her in life, he kept a small painted likeness of her beside his bed. It showed her with downcast eyes, a strand of pearls in her hand. The king died in 1547, on the last day of March, as the morning sun touched the gray curtains of his chamber. A priest whispered prayers. Anne held his hand. There was no dramatic final word, no gasping declaration, only a breath, a stillness, and then a long silence. The court, which had once sparkled with his charisma and chaos, fell quiet. And thus passed Francis Thumpert, a king of beauty and blemish, adored and betrayed in equal measure. Remembered best for the passions that shaped his age and the silences that lingered after he was gone.